In the autumn of 1374, a merchant ship left the port of Marseille, bound for the trading houses of Venice. Its cargo hold contained no gold, no precious gems, no silks from the Orient. Instead, carefully wrapped in waxed leather pouches and guarded more zealously than a king's ransom, were bundles of dried purple flowers, more precisely, the tiny crimson threads plucked from their centers. This was saffron, and in the medieval world, pound for pound, it was worth more than gold itself. To understand how a simple flower could command such extraordinary value, we must journey back to a time when spices shaped empires. Fortunes were made and lost over aromatic threads, and the color of your clothing could determine whether you lived or died. This is the story of saffron, the red gold of the Middle Ages. Our story begins not in Europe, but in the sun-scorched plateaus of Persia, where Crocus sativus first enchanted the ancient world. The ancient Persians called it Zarparan, meaning having golden stigmas. The Greeks knew it as Crocos, a name steeped in tragic mythology. Dr. Sarah Martinez, botanical historian. Saffron is, quite literally, one of the most remarkable plants in human history. Each flower of Crocus sativus produces only 3 crimson stigmas, the female reproductive parts of the flower. These stigmas must be harvested by hand on a single day when the flower blooms, in the early morning before the sun can damage them. And here's the extraordinary part. It takes approximately 150 flowers to produce just 1 gram of dried saffron. 150 flowers, 3 stigmas each, 450 individual threads, picked by hand, one at a time. To produce a single pound of saffron required approximately 75,000 flowers and countless hours of painstaking labor. But the plant's requirements made it even more valuable. Crocus sativus is a sterile hybrid, incapable of reproducing through seeds. Every single saffron crocus in existence must be planted by human hands, propagated through its corm's underground bulb-like structures. The plant is utterly dependent on human cultivation for its survival, and humans became utterly dependent on its value by the time medieval Europe emerged from the ruins of the Roman Empire. Saffron had already been traversing the known world for millennia. Alexander the Great reputedly bathed in saffron-infused water to heal his battle wounds. Cleopatra used it in her cosmetics. Roman emperors scattered saffron on the floors of theaters and amphitheaters, so that every footstep released its intoxicating aroma. Professor James Whitmore, medieval economic historian. We have to understand that medieval Europe was obsessed with spices in a way that's almost incomprehensible to us today. These weren't luxuries in the way we think of luxuries. They were fundamental to how people experienced status, taste, medicine, and even spirituality. Saffron sat at the apex of this spice pyramid. The Silk Road carried saffron from Persia through Central Asia, along with silk, jewels, and other precious goods. But there was another route, one that would shape European history for centuries. The Mediterranean spice trade, controlled first by Byzantine merchants, then by Islamic traders, and finally contested by the rising maritime powers of Venice, Genoa, and later Spain. In the 13th century, a pound of saffron in England cost the same as a horse. By some estimates, it was worth more than 3 times its weight in gold. To put this in perspective, a skilled craftsman might earn 3 pence per day. A single ounce of saffron could cost 15 shillings, that's 180 pence. A man could work 2 months without a single day off and still not afford a single ounce of the spice. But why? What made these dried flower stigmas so valuable that merchants would risk shipwreck, pirates, and robbery to transport them? What made nobles willing to pay a king's ransom for a few precious ounces? The answer lies in the medieval understanding of medicine, cuisine, and the nature of reality itself. Dr. Catherine Bloom, historian, medieval medicine, operated on the theory of the 4 humus: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant balance. Illness meant imbalance. and saffron was considered one of the most powerful balancing agents in the entire medical pharmacopoeia. Medieval physicians prescribed saffron for an astonishing array of ailments. Melancholy, saffron to lift the spirits; plague, saffron to purify the blood; digestive troubles, saffron to aid the stomach; heart palpitations, saffron to strengthen the heart. The list seemed endless. The medieval medical text, Tequinum Sanitatis, declared that saffron comforts the heart and helps against melancholy. The famous 14th century surgeon Guy de Cialiac prescribed saffron mixed with rosewater for eye infections. The Persian physician Avicenna, whose medical texts dominated medieval European medicine, praised saffron as a cure for more than 90 diseases. Fascinating is that modern research has actually validated some of these uses. Saffron does contain compounds with anti-inflammatory and antioxidant properties. Studies suggest it may have mood-enhancing effects, possibly helping with mild depression. The medieval physicians weren't entirely wrong though, obviously. They vastly overestimated its curative powers. But in an age where the Black Death could wipe out a third of a continent's population in a matter of years, where even a simple infection could prove fatal, people were willing to pay almost any price for hope. And saffron represented hope. Yet medicine wasn't saffron's only claim to medieval fame. In the kitchens of the wealthy, saffron was considered essential, not merely a luxury, but a necessity for anyone who wished to demonstrate their status and refinement. Chef Marcus Aldridge, historical cuisine expert, medieval cuisine was completely different from what we'd recognize today. The wealthy didn't just want their food to taste good, they wanted it to look spectacular. Color was incredibly important, and saffron provided the most lustrous, radiant, golden color imaginable. A dish tinged with saffron literally glowed on the table. Medieval cookbooks are filled with recipes calling for saffron. The Form of Cury, a recipe collection from the court of King Richard II of England, compiled around 1390, includes saffron in nearly half of its 196 recipes. Saffron colored everything from simple rice dishes to elaborate meat preparations, from sauces to desserts. One recipe, Viande de Cyprus, calls for chicken almonds, and saffron, so much saffron that the dish would shine as gold. Another, Riz de Fleisch, combines rice, meat, and saffron into a golden porridge that would be recognizable to modern fans of risotto. But there was also a symbolic dimension. Gold represented divinity, purity, the light of heaven. By eating golden-colored food, medieval diners believed they were consuming something almost holy, elevating themselves closer to the divine. It was gastronomy and theology combined on a single plate. If saffron's culinary uses demonstrated wealth, and its medicinal properties offered hope, then its use as a dye represented the ultimate expression of power and sanctity. In medieval Europe, sumptuary laws regulations controlling who could wear what governed every aspect of fashion and display. Colors weren't merely aesthetic choices. They were legal declarations of status, and certain colors were reserved for the highest echelons of society. Professor Whitmore saffron-dyed cloth occupied a peculiar position. It produced a brilliant yellow-gold color that was associated with both royalty and spirituality. Buddhist monks dyed their robes with saffron, as did Hindu holy men. In Ireland, saffron-dyed lean shirts became associated with Gaelic nobility. The color screamed expense because everyone knew how much saffron it took to dye even a small piece of cloth. The amounts required were staggering. To dye a single robe a deep saffron yellow might require more saffron than a peasant family would see in a lifetime. And unlike some dyes that could be faked with cheaper alternatives, true saffron yellow had a distinctive luminosity that was impossible to counterfeit. In medieval illuminated manuscripts, saffron mixed with other pigments produced golden yellows for angels' halos, Christ's robes, and the decorative borders that framed sacred texts. In the famous tiares, Richard's heirs, du Duc de Berry, created in the early 15th century, Saffron yellow gleams from dozens of pages. Dr. Mayartianese, there's a beautiful irony here. Saffron is extraordinarily light sensitive. Cloth dyed with pure saffron will fade relatively quickly when exposed to sunlight. So these incredibly expensive garments had to be carefully stored, brought out only for the most important occasions, then hidden away again. The color itself was ephemeral, transient, which somehow made it even more precious. In the autumn of 1374, we returned to where our story began, that merchant ship leaving Marseille, but this vessel never reached Venice. Pirates intercepted it off the coast of Liguria. The crew fought valiantly, but they were overwhelmed. The pirates weren't interested in the ship itself or in taking slaves. They wanted only one thing: the 800 pounds of saffron hidden in the cargo hold. 800 pounds, worth approximately 80,000 gold Florenzanoff, to fund a small army, to build a cathedral, to buy a significant estate, and every ounce was stolen. But the pirates had made a critical error. The saffron belonged to merchants from Basel, Switzerland, and the merchants of Basel did not forgive. What followed became known as the Saffron War, a 14-week conflict that would demonstrate just how seriously medieval society took the theft. Professor Whitmerua talking about a full-scale military conflict over a spice. The Basel merchants didn't just want compensation, they wanted the saffron returned, and they wanted the thieves punished. They hired mercenaries, fortified positions, and laid siege to the areas where they believed the pirates were sheltering. 14 weeks of actual warfare over stolen saffron threads. The conflict eventually spread beyond the original merchants. Neighboring towns took sides. Old grudges were revived. What began as a matter of stolen property became entangled with feudal politics, trade rivalries, and territorial disputes. Records suggest that dozens died in the fighting. Towns were besieged. Trade routes were disrupted, all for saffron. In the end, the merchants recovered only a portion of their lost spice. Some of the thieves were captured and executed. Others escaped, presumably with enough saffron to live in luxury for years. What the Saffron War demonstrates is that we're not talking about a luxury good in the way we use that term today. This was a strategic commodity, like oil in the modern world. People would kill for it. They would die for it. Entire trading networks were built on it. It was that important. Where there is extreme value, fraud inevitably follows. And nowhere was this truer than in the medieval saffron trade. Saffron fraud became so widespread and so sophisticated that it spawned entirely new legal codes and enforcement mechanisms. The practice became known as saffroning, the art of stretching, adulterating, or outright counterfeiting saffron to increase profits. Techniques were remarkably varied. Some merchants would dampen the saffron to increase its weight since it was sold by weight. Wet saffron meant more profit. Others would mix in threads from other plants, marigold petals, safflower threads, even dyed corn silk. The most brazen would grind real saffron into powder and mix it with turmeric or other yellow spices, almost impossible to detect without tasting. Medieval authorities responded with draconian punishments. In 15th century Nuremberg, the Safranschuh Code detailed exactly how saffron should be inspected and what punishments awaited adulterators. The penalties were severe. Merchants caught adulterating saffron could be fined, imprisoned, or have their entire stock confiscated. In some German states, the punishment for severe saffron fraud was death, burned alive with their adulterated merchandise. We have records of actual executions. In 1444, in Nuremberg, a merchant named Jobst Findecker was buried alive, along with his adulterated saffron. Another man, Elzes Pfister, was burned to death for the same crime. These weren't idle threats. The authorities were deadly serious about maintaining the integrity of the saffron trade. The existence of such harsh penalties reveals a fundamental truth about medieval economics. Trust was everything. In an age before sophisticated chemical analysis, before standardized measures and regulatory agencies, Commerce depended entirely on reputation. A merchant who would cheat with saffron would cheat with anything. They threatened the entire fabric of trade. But if saffron commanded such astronomical prices in Europe, an obvious question arose. Why not grow it ourselves? The answer was, they tried. For centuries, they tried. Saffron cultivation had reached Europe during the Islamic conquests of Iberia. By the 10th century, saffron was being grown in Al-Andalus Islamic, Spain particularly around Toledo and Granada. The Islamic agronomists had perfected techniques for cultivating the delicate crocuses, and their saffron became legendary for its quality. Saffron successfully requires very specific conditions: well-drained soil, hot, dry summers, cold winters, but not too cold, exactly the right balance of rainfall. The corms need to be planted at precisely the right depth, at exactly the right time. The fields need to be rotated carefully because the soil becomes depleted. It's incredibly demanding, but beyond the agricultural challenges, there was a more fundamental problem: getting the corms themselves. Saffron growers guarded their corms jealously. These were the genetic stock of their entire industry. Selling corms to foreigners would be like giving away their livelihood. So saffron corms became contraband, smuggled goods as precious as the spice itself. Legends arose about how saffron cultivation spread through medieval Europe, tales of pilgrims concealing corms in hollow staffs, of merchants bribing guards, of monks on secret missions to acquire the precious bulbs. One famous legend involves an English pilgrim in the 14th century who allegedly hid a single saffron corm in a hollow walking stick and smuggled it back to England. The story goes that he risked execution to bring it home, where it became the foundation of the English saffron industry. Whether it's literally true is questionable, but it reflects a genuine historical reality. Obtaining saffron corms was dangerous, expensive, and potentially illegal by the 14th century. One region of England had become so successful at saffron cultivation that it became synonymous with the spice itself. Saffron Walden, originally known simply as Chipping, Warden, Chipping, meaning market. The town acquired its more famous name from the purple flowers that transformed its fields every autumn. At its peak, Saffron Walden and the surrounding area produced enough saffron to supply much of England's domestic market and even export some to the continent. Saffron Walden, the town's entire economy revolved around saffron. There were saffron merchants, saffron growers, saffron dyers, saffron dealers. The wealth that flowed through Saffron Walden allowed them to build a magnificent church, St. Mary's, that still stands today. That church was essentially built on saffron money. The success of English saffron cultivation provided some relief from dependency on expensive imports. But even at its height, English saffron couldn't compete with the quality or quantity of Spanish saffron. The best saffron still came from Spain, specifically from La Mancha, the same region that would later become famous as the setting for Don Quixote's adventures. Spanish saffron, particularly from the area around Consuegra, developed a reputation as the finest in the world. The combination of soil, climate, and centuries of accumulated expertise produced saffron threads of exceptional color, aroma, and potency. Spanish saffron has a more intense, complex flavor profile, floral notes, subtle honey undertones, a slight bitter edge that balances perfectly. It's not just about intensity, it's about the balance of flavors. Medieval connoisseurs could absolutely tell the difference, and they were willing to pay a premium for it. In October 1347, 12 Genoese ships docked at the Sicilian port of Messina. The crews were dying, covered in black boils that oozed blood and pus. Most were already dead. The ships were immediately ordered to leave, but it was too late. The Black Death had arrived in Europe. Over the next 5 years, the plague would kill between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's entire population. Between 75 and 200 million people died. Entire villages were abandoned. Fields went unplowed. Cities became charnel houses. And in the midst of this catastrophe, The demand for saffron exploded. People were desperate. The medical establishment had no effective treatments for the plague cow. Could they? They didn't understand germ theory, didn't know about bacteria, but they had to try something. And saffron, with its reputation as a powerful medicine, became one of the most sought-after remedies. Physicians prescribed saffron in countless preparations. Saffron mixed with wine to drink. Saffron infused in water for washing plague sores. Saffron burned as incense to purify the air, which they believed carried the disease. Saffron mixed with medicinal syrupaz, a general preventative. Famous for thieves, vinegar, a legendary remedy, supposedly used by thieves who robbed plague victims without getting sick. And saffron among its ingredients, along with garlic, rosemary, and various other herbs steeped in vinegar. Of course, none of this actually worked against the plague. Bubonic plague is caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, spread by flea bites. No amount of saffron could prevent or cure it. But understanding that it didn't work doesn't diminish the historical significance of what people believed and how they acted on those beliefs. The result was a saffron shortage of unprecedented proportions, with a third of the population dead, including many saffron growers. Production plummeted just as demand soared. Prices reached levels that made the pre-plague markets seem almost reasonable. We have records showing that saffron prices increased by 500% or more in some markets during the plague years. But even at those prices, there simply wasn't enough. Merchants who had stockpiles became wealthy beyond measure. Those who needed it and couldn't afford it, which was most people, turned to increasingly desperate alternatives. The plague years saw saffron fraud reach new heights of audacity and sophistication, with genuine saffron practically worth its weight in gold, and sometimes worth more. The temptation to counterfeit became overwhelming. Mart, Myotianista, counterfeiting techniques became incredibly elaborate. We're not just talking about mixing in a few marigold petals anymore. Skilled counterfeiters developed recipes for fake saffron they would take flower petals, treat them with various chemicals to achieve the right color, soak them in honey water to get the right texture, even add small amounts of real saffron to pass the taste test. One technique involves soaking meat fibers in saffron, extract until they absorb the color and some of the flavor, then drying them to look like genuine saffron threads. Another used thin slices of turnip or other vegetables, dyed and dried. The most sophisticated counterfeiters used actual flower parts from crocosizers, but not crocosizers, instead using cheaper, non-aromatic species. The authorities responded with increasingly desperate measures. Saffron inspectors' official positions in many European cities were given broad powers to raid warehouses, test merchandise, and confiscate suspect goods, which was a major hub of the spice trade. They created the Saffron Hall, a dedicated building where all saffron entering the city had to be inspected and certified. Merchants couldn't sell saffron anywhere else. This centralization made inspection easier, but it also created opportunities for corruption. Inspectors could be bribed. Officials could look the other way. The more valuable saffron became, the greater the incentive for everyone in the system to cheat. But the plague transformed saffron's role in medieval society in ways that went beyond simple economics. It became embedded in the social fabric of survival, hope, and community response to catastrophe. Monasteries, which served as hospitals during the plague, consumed vast quantities of saffron in their preparations. The monks and nuns who tended the sick believed they were providing real medical care, and, in an age of psychological medicine, perhaps they were. The act of receiving medicine, of being cared for, of maintaining hope, these things mattered, even if the medicine itself was ineffective. Actually, an interesting question here about the placebo effect and medieval medicine. Modern research shows that saffron does have some psychoactive properties. It can affect mood. In the context of plague treatment, where patients were terrified and depressed, anything that lifted spirits might have had some beneficial effect on outcomes. Not by fighting the disease, but by helping patients maintain the will to live. Wealthy families stockpiled saffron as plague insurance. Having a supply meant you could attempt treatment, could offer it to sick family members, could use it as payment for caregivers willing to risk their lives tending plague victims. Some wealthy merchants included saffron specifically in their wills. I bequeath to my eldest son my stores of saffron, to be used for the health of the family. The saffron trade also created interesting dynamics during the plague. Merchants who dealt in saffron often became sick because the spice trade required constant contact with travelers from plague-affected regions. But the immense profits meant there were always new merchants willing to take the risk. Professor W could make enough from a single, successful saffron deal during the plague years to set up your family for generations if you survived. It was a gamble, but for ambitious young merchants with little to lose, it was a gamble worth taking. The plague paradoxically accelerated social mobility in this way. By the early 15th century, as Europe slowly recovered from the catastrophe of the Black Death, a new order emerged in the spice trade, and at its center sat Venice, the most serene republic. Venice had been important before the plague, but in the century after 1400, it achieved something close to complete dominance over the Mediterranean spice trade. Venetian merchants controlled the routes from the Levant. Venetian ships carried the spices. Venetian banks financed the trade, and Venetian authorities regulated, taxed, and profited from every ounce that passed through their hands. Professor Alessandro Rossini, Venetian Economic History. Venice's spice monopoly was built on several foundations. First, they had the ships, a merchant fleet unmatched in Europe. Second, they had the relationships, centuries of diplomatic and commercial ties with Islamic traders in Egypt and the Levant. Third, they had the capital. Venetian banks could finance the huge upfront costs that the spice trade required. And fourth, they had the political will to maintain their monopoly through whatever means necessary: diplomacy, bribery, or force. Saffron flowed into Venice from multiple sources. Spanish saffron came by ship from Barcelona. Persian saffron arrived via overland routes through Constantinople and the Byzantine territories. Kashmir saffron, considered by some to be the finest of all, came through Arab intermediaries who had carried it across the deserts. In Venice's Rialto market, saffron merchants operated from dedicated stalls. The trade was so important that it had its own guild, the Arte dei Spezieri, or Guild of Spice Dealers. Membership in the guild was carefully controlled, passed from father to son, jealously guarded. Professor Cyanithe's Spice Guild wasn't just about trade regulation, it was a political force. Guild members sat on Venice's governing councils. They influenced policy, they could make or break commercial treaties. Saffron money built palaces, endowed churches, financed military campaigns. You can still see the evidence today in Venice's architecture, buildings that owe their existence to the spice trade. But Venice's dominance was built on foundations that were already beginning to crack, and the earthquake that would shatter them came from the east. On May 29, 1453, after a siege of nearly 2 months, Ottoman forces under Sultan Mehmed II breached the walls of Constantinople. The last remnant of the Roman Empire fell. The Byzantine Empire, which had endured for over 1,000 years, ceased to exist. The fall of Constantinople reverberated throughout Europe, but in the counting houses of Venice, the news carried a particular dread. Constantinople had been their gateway to the east, their primary link to the overland spice routes. Now it belonged to the Ottomans. Professor Whitor. Ottoman conquest didn't immediately end the spice trade. The Ottomans were pragmatic. They wanted the tax revenue, but it fundamentally changed the dynamics. Now there was a powerful Muslim empire controlling the routes. They could dictate terms. They could raise prices. They could, if they chose, cut off the supply entirely. Venice negotiated new arrangements with the Ottomans, paying higher prices and taxes for the privilege of continuing the trade. Spanish saffron became even more important as a domestic source that bypassed Ottoman control. But the writing was on the wall. The old order was changing, and then, in 1498, a Portuguese navigator named Vasco da Gama did something that would change the world forever. He sailed around Africa and reached India. The sea route to the Spice Islands was open. The age of exploration had begun, and with it, the slow decline of Venice's spice monopoly and the medieval saffron trade itself. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In the middle decades of the 15th century, at the height of Venice's power, saffron continued to shape the politics and economics of Europe in fascinating ways. Saffron became a tool of diplomacy. Rulers gave gifts of saffron to curry favor, to seal alliances, to demonstrate their wealth and power. A pound of the finest Spanish saffron made an appropriate gift for a king. Several pounds could serve as part of a royal dowry. Professor R.O.S. Highsmith have records of saffron being used, almost like currency in high-level diplomatic negotiations. In 1453, the same year, Constantinople, Felver, Duke of Milan, sent 5 pounds of premium saffron to the French king as part of a complex diplomatic negotiation. That was worth roughly 5,000 gold ducats to pay a small army for a month. The Medici family of Florence, arguably the most powerful banking dynasty in Europe, dealt extensively in saffron. Their account books show purchases and sales of saffron alongside loans to kingdoms and the financing of artistic masterpieces. Saffron wasn't separate from high culture and high finance. It was part of the same system. Lorenzo de' Medici, known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, patron of Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, traded in saffron as casually as he commissioned sculptures. For him and his peers, there was no contradiction. Art, spices, banking, politics were all interconnected expressions of power, and sophistication is how saffron shows up in unexpected places. In the account books of building projects, the saffron used in medicinal preparations for injured workers. In military records, saffron as part of military pay or provisions. In church, records saffron for dyeing altar cloths and priestly vestments. It had penetrated every level of medieval and early Renaissance society. As Europe transitioned from the medieval period into the Renaissance, the way people thought about saffron and everything else began to change. The foundations of modern science were being laid. Anatomists like Andreas Vesalius were dissecting human bodies